I want to give a special shout out to our sponsors for tonight. And a lot of the food you're eating in this venue is thanks to their efforts and their graciousness, okay? And the first one is the Orange Pill app. And if you're not familiar with the Orange Pill app, we had some flyers with QR codes. And I highly recommend you get that and get onto your phone and find out what the Orange Pill app is all about. It's basically a social network built on top of Bitcoin. It's the social Bitcoin layer, okay? And it's all about meeting Bitcoiners in your area. It's a geotagged social network, all about privacy and meeting Bitcoiners not on Twitter, but in person, okay? And this is like what Jeff and I did without the Orange Pill app, but the Orange Pill app is going to help facilitate this, like for everybody, not just the people here tonight, but everybody who starts to get involved with Bitcoin and wants to meet others. Jeff and I met each other through Twitter, but then we got together at a Starbucks, face to face, human to human, and that's what like tonight has it sort of turned into what we're all experiencing tonight and sharing. Okay, it's like human interactions, and the Orange Pill app understands this, and they're trying to help facilitate it with their product. So please go check out the Orange Pill app. We thank them for their sponsorship tonight. Our second sponsor is Swan Bitcoin. I already mentioned that they donated their ticket to Pacific Bitcoin. They also donated some awesome books. Hopefully some people got them by Jan Pritzker. And we really appreciate Swan's efforts. They are, if you're not familiar with them, they're the best way to grow your stack of Bitcoin, okay? You can set up a DCA and then just relax. And they will help you figure out how to take your Bitcoin into self-custody if that's what you want to do. They're all about education. They're one of the best in the business, and we really appreciate them, and we appreciate their sponsorship tonight. And finally, Unchained Capital. If you're not familiar with Unchained Capital, I'm a customer. They're all about collaborative custody and taking your Bitcoin keys into your own custody with a multi-sig setup. Okay, they're basically your new age Bitcoin native financial services company. And their goal is to help you get the most out of your Bitcoin while holding your own keys. Their flagship product is this collaborative custody multi-sig, but they have other products like a lending product. They also have a Bitcoin IRA product and inheritance planning. So they are helping to build the infrastructure that is going to support mass adoption of Bitcoin. And it's incredible to see the businesses being built. I was down in Austin, Texas at Unchained, their offices last month at the Bitcoin Commons, and they held a seminar down there. And I'm telling you, it's inspiring to see all the entrepreneurs working in this space, building companies that are supporting this community and building this movement. And it's unbelievable what's happening. So I thank Unchained. I thank all of our sponsors. I also want to shout out Foundation Devices, who's been stepped up to be our lead sponsor for the Freedom Festival. We couldn't do it without Zach and Foundation Devices. They have a state-of-the-art Bitcoin hardware wallet, and they're also coming out with a new mobile wallet that will sort of be in sync with their hardware wallet. It's going to be an awesome thing. It's called the Envoy, and their hardware wallet's called the Passport. So check out Foundation Devices, and we really thank them for their support. All right, bear with me for a minute. We're in Massachusetts, obviously. And this is where the seeds of the American Revolution were sown 250 years ago. And that movement, if you've studied your history, was started by a brave minority of colonists. Not everybody, a brave minority. They were sick and tired of being ruled over by an oppressive monarch. And they were sick and tired of taxation without representation. And they were sick and tired of being lied to and stolen from. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they stood up and they gathered together and they organized and they said enough is enough. And they fought for their liberty. That's why we're here today. And now it's our turn to stand up. We can't live in fear anymore. We can't allow ourselves to be surveilled 24 hours a day. We can't lose sight of our American ideals. It's about independence, sovereignty, personal property rights, privacy, and freedom. It's about innovation. It's about our kids, and about our kids' kids. It's about hope, it's about peace, it's about love. It's about valuing everyone's precious time. It's about measuring and storing value and time in a hard money that has no counterparty risk and can't be debased. It's about separating money and state. It's about fairness. It's about holding hands. It's about working together. It's about sharing and being kind. It's simple, really. It's about everything we learned in kindergarten. And it's about building a human society built on a foundation of bedrock, not sand. It's about peace, hope, love, and truth. It's about Bitcoin. Thank you. Now I want to turn it over to our guest speaker, Luke Broyles. Luke burst onto the Bitcoin Twitter scene this year after posting a couple mind-blowing tweets, and I was one of the guys whose mind was blown, all right? Unbelievable. He talked about the increasingly rapid pace of innovation taking place in the human society and the implications of the discovery of a digital scarcity and where we're heading in the future based on that. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Luke on a few occasions now over the last couple months, and I'm going to tell you, he is a genuine guy. He's a deep thinker. He's at the beginning of his career. He's not a billionaire. He doesn't have a 401k plan. He doesn't even own a home, okay? He's just getting started. But he does grasp the importance and the magnitude of Bitcoin, and he's sharing his clairvoyance with the world. He's generous with his time, and we appreciate him being here with us tonight to share some of his thoughts on this fascinating topic. Without further ado, let's give it up for Luke Broyles.
Well, that was very kind. Thank you, Greg. But before I start at all, I just have to thank Greg and Jeff. They have been so kind to me, both on Twitter and now in person. I met them both this morning for the first time, and I would not be here, or would not have made it out without their support, and obviously without them inviting me. So thank you guys. I really appreciate it. It means a lot. It's been quite the journey. I know for probably most, maybe not everyone, but for most people in the room, it becomes quite lonely sometimes when you're trying to explain this idea and trying to communicate with others, and you're just feeling like you're hitting a brick wall, and that's fine, it's understandable, but it's been really surreal over the last 3 months or so to just post a few things on Twitter and have people such as Greg and Jeff reach out and be so supportive. So it means a lot to them. Thank you for them, and thank you for every single person that's showed up. I hope that I've prepared things that you enjoy. So thank you, appreciate it. So. Thank you. So as Greg said, I'm thinking of having 2 shorter mini presentations. The first one being something that I've already put online, actually the first thread that more or less blew up overnight, and the one that Greg first reached out to me about, that one about having less in common with the future than the past. So that's the first half of the talk tonight. And then the second half I wanted to talk about because of Boston. And Greg had a wonderful intro to that here, but basically about how the United States of America is, more or less 250 years old, at least in its modern sense. And so one of my ideas was, what about the next 250 years? What could we expect? And is it even rational trying to expect that? So they're both related, but I thought they both had a different vantage point there. So anyway, I hope they're both valuable. How many people have seen this first thread, perhaps, just so I get an idea? This one here, just raise your hands maybe. Okay, so like a third, a half or so. Okay, great, so this will be new to a lot of you. So I'll just get right into it here. So the initial claim I made, am I standing in front of me? Okay. The initial claim I made was that we today, talking right now, have less in common with the future, with our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, than we do with the past, with our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. And before I even talk about Bitcoin, in my own personal experience, and I've been very fortunate to talk to a wide variety of people about it, I've found consistently that coming from the vantage point of this and of technology, something that's so undeniable is something that people really grasp onto. And then once that is grasped and they understand the change, then Bitcoin becomes, in my opinion, more or less self-evident, which is then what gets later onto the thread here. But for me, that's been really helpful in not just talking about, oh, this is Bitcoin, you gotta buy it because it's gonna go up, but to understand what's actually happening here. And I would argue what's actually happening here is that all of society is basically a function of technology. And as technology increases in speed, the way at which we interact with each other and the way at which we interact with the world and the technologies we use also change. So, let's see what we got first from here. So before, and I know many people here might already agree with that claim, but for those that maybe that doesn't make sense, what I'm really saying, if we look towards the past and towards the backwards instead of the future, is basically thinking about the world 100 years ago versus today. And some of the examples I gave are a bit, well, you can read the examples on there obviously, but just thinking about today. I woke up this morning in Michigan with an alarm clock plugged into the wall that has this magic thing called electricity running through it, and then I got in a car that runs on gas, went to a plane, flew through the air, got here, met with Greg and Jeff. You know, it's like my whole day today, and meeting all of you, now speaking in this weird thing being uploaded. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin explaining this to somebody from 100 years ago or 150 years ago or so. And ultimately, this is a good thing. This innovation, this progress has been a net benefit to society. As you can see in the chart here, what you have is world poverty over the last 200 years, from 1820s now today to the 2020s. And I was in Israel late last year, and I was amazed in thinking about how that place has not changed for basically the entirety of recorded history until the majority of change has been in the last 100 years or so, since Israel and Palestine became modernized, and since people began archaeological digs and building infrastructure in large cities. These rocks and these stones have sat here, and there has been more change to this landscape in the last decades and centuries than the centuries and millennia before that. And so ultimately this is a good thing. That as we have more people, there's more technology, more prosperity, and everyone's able to benefit more. So some examples I gave about how childbirth is still dangerous, of course, but not nearly to the degree that it was just 1 or 2 generations ago. I have family members just 1 or 2 generations back, and my grandparents and great-grandparents that passed away because of childbirth. They had siblings that passed away. It's a dramatically different world today, where childbirth is it's the beginning of life, and from the very, very beginning to the very end, our whole society is completely different. Malaria. There are some estimates saying that half of all humans ever born have died due to malaria. So obviously that's hotly contested, but that's really something to think about. That's something we don't even experience today. And so the way childbirth being the beginning and our inevitable deaths being the end, even the way that we die and even the way that we experience the end of life has dramatically changed. And ultimately this is a good thing because there's less child mortality and we're all living happier, healthier lives. So again, with infants and air conditioning and everything else, and with poverty specifically, there's been a more rapid decrease of global absolute poverty in the last century or two than the thousands and thousands of years before that. And that's why I think this message is ultimately optimistic. And that's something else I really try to convey to people. When they hear Bitcoin, inflation, there is a negative connotation to that, and I think that's true. But I think ultimately it's the optimistic vision that really gets people to engage and consider it more. So likewise, most people have never been to a foreign land, let alone travel to Boston one morning just to meet a bunch of people. It's a trip that would have been mind-blowing to people just 100 years ago or so. And a couple hundred years before that, people wouldn't have even known North America existed, or at least Europe and Asia at least. Life expectancy was similar for the vast majority of human history until recently, and it's only been increasing at exponential pace. Entertainment, the fact that we have entertainment at our fingertips, and we have all these subscriptions and 1 million hours of any form of content we want at our fingertips, basically for free, is something completely new. I believe more or less that the idea of retirement and the idea of entertainment and the way that we consume content today is more or less a new invention in the last couple hundred years. Before we've had this industrialized world, the way at which we spent our leisure time is completely different. The horse, obviously, was the most common form of transportation, and I don't know the last time any of us rode a horse to get from point A to point B. And so, likewise, education beyond basic farming is extremely rare. In local communities, people spent their lives in local communities, and today we don't anymore. Again, coming back to the Boston thing, many of my friends have met online through pixels on my little black magic box we call a phone, even though it's more like an everything device. And so anyway, these are just the kinds of musings I find fascinating in comparing just how people that I could have known or I could have met have seen such a degree of change that the 10 generations before them perhaps had not seen. Now, I think there are many ways to quantify global wealth and this and that and the other, but for me, what's been most useful in communicating to people, and perhaps the best visual, is this one here, about global energy production. So obviously, going back to 1800, all the way up to today, you can see that global energy production has absolutely skyrocketed. And I'll talk about this more in my second presentation later in depth because I find it fascinating. But of course, the basic idea being that as there are more humans and as we have higher standards of living, we have more and more energy at an exponential rate. And that's not new at all, which, like I said, I'll get more into later. And then the specific innovations that we use that energy for, those also are increasing both in number and how many there are, and they're also increasing in speed. You can clearly see how the slope is getting faster and faster and faster. And so obviously one of the side questions is the internet is growing at an absurd speed. We're roughly 60% adoption for the internet today globally. It's we've still got like halfway to go, more or less, globally speaking. Billions of people are yet to use the internet on a daily or bi-daily basis. And so what is next after the internet? That's one of the questions that I think most people should be asking, because by the time it reaches 5%, 10% adoption, whatever that is, it might change the world in the same way that social media in the mid-2000s was just single-digit or low double-digit adoption, yet it was already changing the world in ways that we 10 years before that couldn't have imagined. So basically taking this chart and just turning it into a simple line, taking the methods of energy out of it and turning it into a simple graph, that's basically the kind of vision, or at least the idea I'm trying to communicate here, that for the entirety of human history, even though it looks flat to us, it's an exponential line that's growing and doubling and tripling, going up and up and up and up, even though it's flat to us by comparison. And then, you get here, the Industrial Revolution, 1800, 1900. Then you have the computer here, 1948, with another incredible spike upwards. And so now, obviously, today we're at the end of the overlaid chart here. And so basically my thought experiment is, well, what do we think is going to happen in the future? To me, I think it's pretty binary. Either the future is going to be better or it's going to be worse. Either going to be more humans or less humans. Either there's going to be more innovation or continuing innovation, or innovation will stagnate. And so while none of us know what the future will hold, I think that's the most logical and probable expectation, that we will only have more people and they will only use more energy into the future. And one of the reasons I think that's the case is because every new form of energy that we have been able to harness and channel has been a lower degree of harm on the planet and been a higher degree of efficiency. So, for example, when we're cutting down trees and burning wood, that is very inefficient and very destructive on the planet. And then we upgrade to better forms of energy and better and better and better. And now we have rumors of hopefully fission energy and everything of that sort, very enticing for the future. But basically that's kind of the world that I think we're either going in one direction or another. And so then obviously, bringing it back to the money, what does that mean for money? What has money been through our history? Well, money is, in my view, money has essentially been the best form of communicating value that we've had the technological ability to do. So copper, shells, salt, grain, all these kinds of things were money, because at that time, those things were the edge of what was the most valuable, what people were able to expend energy on, because that was the limit of their tiny little energy expenditure there. And so as society upgrades its ability to channel energy and its ability to move energy, its ability to have a harder form of money also increases. And so if we assume, and if we hope, that global energy production only increases in the future, what does that mean for the money? Well, obviously some of you have probably seen this chart, but this is the Consumer Price Index cumulative for the United States from 1775 to the 2000, so roughly 250 years, like I'm going to talk about in my next presentation here. But basically, what do we see? Well, we see another exponential line. However, the problem here is that there's no tie to energy production. If I want more cash, I can just make another zero, right? I don't have to expend energy to make that, except the ink that I put on the piece of paper, or the flipping the bit from a 0 to a 1 on a digital screen. And so my question is, if right now we have a world that is dependent on what I jokingly called political currency units, but now it's kind of taken off on Twitter, which has been a pleasant surprise. But the term political currency units, meaning that they are numbers, they're numbers that we use as currency. They're backed by politicians. They're backed by the government's ability to pay them, government's ability to tax, the military, the economy, many factors of the nation. But it's ultimately the government that issues that currency, and that's what we all use. And so my question being, if we're going to only continue to upgrade the world's grid and only use more energy, what does that mean for these? What does that mean for this debt-based money that we've had for the last few hundred years? Every other form of money before it has not survived forever, obviously. What's going to be next, and how soon could that be? So given this, I think the last couple of decades have been especially worrisome as far as the long-term viability of a debt-based, political-based monetary system, but hopefully that chart makes sense to everyone. I'm sure it does. And this video actually is one I really recommend by a YouTuber who's not necessarily a Bitcoiner at a CGP Grey. It's outdated. I hope he makes a new one. But basically, the idea behind this video is about automation. And that if we're going to have more and more automation, which is already the trend we're on, we're going from everyone needs to make every calorie that they're going to consume, everyone needs to hunt or grow every calorie they're going to consume, to now we're having a more and more a higher degree of devised labor, and we're having more and more automation in our society. I don't have to do the math in my head. I can just outsource it to my magic phone / calculator / everything device that can do it for me. And so if we continue this trend where there are more and more, if there's more autonomy in our society, most people assume that that's a bad thing. And I think most people assume it's a bad thing because they are living under this system. They're living under this regime. And when they hear that a robot is coming and it's going to take your job, what people interpret that as they interpret it as saying that a robot is coming to take my wealth, to take my time. And I believe that's because right now we exchange our time for fiat political currency units. And ultimately that means if you can't keep spending a amount of time, you're not going to be able to keep up. Because if you stay flat in the number of units you have, the number of units will debase and you'll still lose purchasing power. And so my question, this is actually one of the things that inspired this thread originally when talking to some friends, was, well, what if automation is actually net a good thing? Thus far, with more and more automation, our energy production has gone up, our population's exploded, standard of living, poverty's gone down, all these wonderful things have happened as we've outsourced more to the innovations and the discoveries that we have. And so what if that continues? And well, what if that means that instead of automation being a bad thing because it's taking our time and harvesting, causing us to go backwards even though we're staying flat in our savings, what if we had a fixed money so that we didn't have to chase yield? And that's where we get into the part that's more specifically about Bitcoin. When I talk to people, as I'm sure many people in here have experienced, I don't want to buy Bitcoin. I'd rather stay safe with my stocks or my mutual funds or whatever, the equities or securities. And to be fair, they have a point. That's what's worked for a very long time, decades and centuries, depending on which country you've been from and depending what companies and indices you've been in. Obviously, not all stocks always perform well or go up. But generally speaking, stocks have been more or less our de facto form of savings. Gold has benefits, but the problem with gold, obviously, is that it's heavy, it's difficult, it's very expensive to store. Stocks are much easier to store and transact and move around than large bars of gold or even more silver. And so that's been, in my view, more or less our de facto money. This chart in particular goes back to 1971, so when Richard Nixon took us off of the gold standard. And so obviously the green line here being the S&P 500 and the blue line being the money supply of the United States. And if you can't see the correlation, I don't know. So basically the idea here being that stocks are like a proxy hard, but they're not really money because they're securities. What you're buying is a piece of paper that a company issues, and you're relying on the CEO and the board of directors and the marketing plan and the regulatory bodies that oversee them, and you're hoping that the country that the company's in doesn't collapse, or perhaps the other countries that the company's in. There's so many external factors that it's clearly not money. And all these other things clearly are money. Gold and oil and all these other things, they have been used as forms of money in the same way that stocks have been used as forms of money. But the problem is that when these things have utility, you're mixing monetary premium and utility together. And likewise, why are stocks valuations so high? we all hear all the time, the stock market's going to crash, and there's going to be a new Great Depression, stocks go down 80%, the end of the stock market or whatever. And I genuinely believe the reason there's all this fear and the reason that fear is increasing is because we all know intuitively that stock valuations are too high. We all feel this stuff is overvalued. There's no way these companies should be trading these multiples, this, that, the other. And ultimately, I think, again, when comparing utility versus monetary premium, what we have here is we're conflating the two. And we're mixing it all together to create this mush, more or less, where we're basically forcing asset prices to go up. And this is one of the things I love about Jeff Booth. And if you haven't bought his book or listened to his podcast, I highly encourage you to do that, just because I think he's brilliant, and I think anyway, I don't want to get off on that tangent too much, but basically his point being that I'm trying to tie in here is that ultimately humans like it when numbers go up. We like it when prices go up. We like it when we're the CEO of a company and we issue stock of our company, and then the stock price goes up. We get more bonuses, everyone likes us more, we get invited news station, it feels good. And so that CEO is going to do everything in their power to make sure the stock price goes up, whether that's making the company better, or if that's just doing stock buybacks or doing whatever they can to force the price to go up a little bit, or perhaps saying a false thing or two online in order to get people to FOMO into it. But the point being that in the same way that a CEO has every incentive to increase their stock price, a given country, because they have the ability to create unlimited currency, then exchange that for real things that have a brute force physical cost, every country wants their assets to go up. So it's like this marriage between the private sector and the public sector. We want house prices to go up because that makes everyone happy, that we don't have these horrible banking failures and mortgage-backed security problems. It's just easier, right, when house prices can keep going up and when stock prices can keep going up. And ultimately what we're doing is we're taking this distortion and moving it over to the ledger. The ledger meaning the numbers on the screen are the numbers that back this money, political currency units, the ledger being the currency itself. So I think I made my point pretty clear here. And so basically what we have this paradox that technology is getting better and better and better. We have an increasing amount of automation. And theoretically, that should mean that prices come down. Things cost less, because more is automated. It takes less effort to make the same amount of stuff. I don't know. I think that kind of makes sense. If we were to travel back to ancient Rome and there were 1 billion Roman gold coins, let's say, and into the future, there's more of everything. There's more oxen, there's more olive oil, more boats, and more trade, and more wealth, and more humans. It seems to me that same number of coins should only increase in value. And so what we've done is we've effectively created this paradox where everything should be falling in price, and yet everything's rising in price, and it's rising exponentially in price. And as many other brilliant minds out there talking about Bitcoin have explained, is that the reason prices have to keep going up is because we can't afford to let the productivity gains of society flow into the money. Because if we were to do that, that would inevitably be a credit collapse. And so we are effectively printing money to offset the gains that technology is bringing to society. And that's, if you get your head around that, that really will, take up brain space for a couple days or a week or so. That's really something to think about. But basically, even though we're making more and more things, we have to have more and more currency in order to price it. Because if we don't, then if you have a political currency in a system that is dependent on yields to survive, and now you can no longer pay those yields because the prices of those assets are going down, that's why you have that. But anyway, and so like I was saying earlier, where'd it go? Human brains think hyperabundance of prosperity is a bad thing because brains would no longer be able to sell their time for currency units. And I believe that most people alive today don't really understand that this problem has been entrenched for the entirety of human history. And so the question being, what if we were to fix that? So anyway, when coming to automation, there'll always be more jobs in the future, but ultimately I think the vast majority of jobs that are the most common jobs are, at least to some degree, at a threat of automation. And again, depending on your worldview, that's a good thing or that's a bad thing. If you're working and saving money that requires yield for you to keep up, then that's a bad thing, and that's disaster, and that's dystopia, and that's what everyone fears when you have the movies about the robots taking over the world. or if you have a worldview where you have a money that doesn't require yield, you have a money that doesn't require debt to back it, and instead saving it means saving it, you don't have counterparty risk, well, then automation seems to be a pretty good thing to me too. And the other thing too is that I didn't really dive into here is that it doesn't mean all these jobs have to go away. Unemployment's 2, 3, 4% typically. If we have automation over the next 5, 10, 20 years, just take away single-digit percentages from some of the largest jobs. That's a large number of the workforce. I mean, frankly, I think, especially my generation in particular, I think is having a hard time finding jobs in large part because so much is being automated and so much is digital now on our phones and computers and everything, which, again, to emphasize, I think is a good thing, but we're having more and more difficulty because the cost of everything is trending towards free. The marginal cost of energy is trending towards free, and when that happens, it becomes more and more economically difficult to keep up, especially when you have money that is backed by debt. And so, yeah, I believe a collapse is coming, but not the fear-mongering collapse of prosperity or a world order or a human population or whatever, but I believe it's a collapse in the need, or again, the marginal cost of energy. And so this open system, closed system metaphor has really been helpful to people. So, if you heard me say this, again and again and again, just bear with me one more time as I emphasize it. But this is something Saylor talks about and other engineers, and is why I think Nikola Tesla and Ford and other engineers really understood the concept of Bitcoin. Is because, a closed system has energy that flows within it. An open system has sort of leak where more energy can flow out or flow in. So if we take gold, for example, you have, again, going back to my example of the Roman coins, you have a certain number of Roman gold coins. Well, what happens when somebody finds a way to mine more gold? Maybe they find a new deposit of gold, maybe they find a more efficient way to refine it, maybe they make fake gold and fool people, whatever the case. If humans can find a way to make more and inject that and dilute the total value, or dilute the number of currency units, monetary units in that system, then that's an open system. And so all these examples here, I don't know if you can read it, so I'll just read some of them, but thinking about how, again, infinite metals, gold, silver, copper, money trends to one. Why is copper or silver not used as money but gold? Well, it's because it's the one that's the least open. It's the one hardest to make more of. And that's why all that monetary premium is trended towards gold for thousands and thousands of years. We have an infinite amount of information. Internet. Infinite promises, derivatives, debt, media, real estate. One of the things about Boston that was interesting, Greg and I were talking about earlier, since we both have an interest in real estate, or history in it at least, is we were talking about how Boston's added more land. It was amazing to me flying in today how I see like some of these big beautiful buildings that have been added in the last few years, and then these other places that look like it's mush, and if you put a shed in it, it would just sink to the bottom of the water. Or whatever. And it's fascinating that when the economic incentive was high enough, even for land, people were able to create more land. It's not just a matter of creating new acres of land, it's also about using land more efficiently and everything like that. So I believe there's an endless amount of real estate, more or less theoretically, and fiat cash, obviously, as the chart previously showed. Weapons, intelligence, population, prosperity, pretty much everything for the entire human history up to this point we've been able to make more of. And the theoretical perfect money would be a form of money that doesn't inflate or deflate. Because if you deflate it, that means you're directly stealing from people. And if you inflate it, that means you're indirectly stealing from people. So it seems to me the perfect money would be something with precisely a 0% inflation rate. One of the metaphors is that of a sinking ship versus a floating ship. You don't want a ship that is going to, somehow magically fly up into the sky and that's not floating anymore. You don't want it to sink. You don't want it to inflate or deflate. You want it just to be steady. Or like Michael Saylor says, you want it to be in orbit. You don't want it to fly out into outer space, but you also don't want it to crash back down to Earth. And that's kind of the idea here. What if we had a closed system that had no incoming new currency units, it had no destroyed currency units inherently in the ledger? That's the idea. What happens when you take an infinite amount of everything and you divide it by that underlying consistent number of units? So we get smart, who I learned is in Boston. I don't think he's here tonight, but anyway, this is a chart that I think hammers it home the best. The orange line being Bitcoin, obviously, where one Bitcoin's always worth one Bitcoin. That's where that term comes from. But basically, one Bitcoin is worth 100% of the Bitcoin. And all these other assets here trend down against it. And when I talk to people, I often get utility mixed up. And the metaphor or the example, I say, it's not even a metaphor, it's literally true. The example I always come back to is that about oxygen. The most valuable thing in this room, in our lives, in our bodies right now, is oxygen, and that's literally true. The thing at which causes biologically the fastest fear response in the human brain is a lack of oxygen. More than water, more than shelter, more than safety, or whatever. A lack of oxygen is what is the, biologically speaking, most paramount and urgent need for us. And yet nobody's paying for it. The venue didn't charge us for it. I don't know the last time you paid rent for oxygen, but the reason that we don't use oxygen for money, even though it's the highest utility thing, quote unquote, is because its supply is infinite. It's an endless open system. You can go anywhere in the world, there's oxygen for miles up that way and thousands of miles that way. There's an endless amount of oxygen, so it doesn't work as money. And so it doesn't matter how valuable, we have some sound here. So anyway, in my view, it doesn't matter how valuable the companies are in the S&P 500. It doesn't matter the value of gold or the ability of putting gold into a bunch of cellular phones and using that. It doesn't matter what the value of these three political currency examples are down here. Point being is that no matter how useful it is, if there is a way at which to create more supply, its price in terms of something at which we can't create more supply inherently has to go down. So I guess to play it one more time, it'll be quiet. There we go. So anyway, this is what's been happening with Bitcoin for the last 14 years. If you take any asset and you price it in terms of Bitcoin over the last decade and a half now almost, is that this is exactly what's occurring. And hopefully most people in here, especially who've been in the Bitcoin space, understand that that's really what's happening here. Yes, Bitcoin's going up in terms of everything else, but if you look at it from the other perspective, really what's happening is everything is collapsing or crashing in terms of Bitcoin, like it should be, because the marginal cost of energy is trending down, because automation is trending up. So like I was just saying, that's one way of looking at it. Prices are falling down in terms of Bitcoin. And I don't know how many people in here have seen this chart, but this is one of my favorite ones out there. On the left, we have a linear chart. In linear terms, logarithmic. Linear on the left, logarithmic on the right, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and logarithmic where you have 1, 10, 100. It goes up by an order of magnitude on the y-axis. And so what most people do is they look at Bitcoin on the left side here, and they say, oh, it's a bubble. Whenever it's going up, they say, it's a bubble, it's a bubble, it's a bubble, it's got to come down. And then when it's going down, they say, oh, it's dead, it's not going anywhere, whatever. And in my opinion, what people fail to understand is that, yes, while this is true, what's really happening and more important is that on the right side. And people can argue that one's more valid than the other, but I think the logarithmic view is much more valid, because technology always, again, going back to energy, human population, everything else, is always exponential. And Greg and I earlier were having a great conversation about a hyperbolic adoption curve, and that's how the value of technologies happen. You have the discovery or the invention of something where it's worth basically nothing, and then it immediately goes from 0 to 1. It lifts off from being worth nothing to being worth something. Like take this group, mass adoption. This is what happened over the last year. This first hyperbolic action went from 0 members to your first meetup was 3 or 4 members, and now we've got over 100 people here perhaps, and many more online watching, and hopefully more people in the future, and at the events you have coming up this summer and future meetups. And so what's happened last year for this group, and likewise other technologies, is to go from 0 to 1. And then, as they develop, as they grow, just like this group is growing now, they continue to trend up, probably with volatility. Some more people join, some people leave, etc. And then eventually, the underlying technology or paradigm or protocol just takes over everything, more or less. And this is true with the locomotive, this is true with the printing press, this is true with the internet. I think that's probably the example that's most applicable to us. But basically, if we assume this tech adoption curve happens with Bitcoin in the same way of all these other technologies, if you overlay price, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect. And I think ultimately that's the strongest case for Bitcoin. Hal Finney, I don't know how many of you know who Hal Finney is, probably most of you, but 1 week after Bitcoin's launch in 2009, he predicted that Bitcoin would go to 10 million US dollars and take over everything in the world and all this. And of course, people thought he was a little crazy. He's like, okay, Al, but but essentially what's happened over the last 14 years is that 2 years before Bitcoin crossed a single US dollar, Hal Finney was predicting this curve, more or less. And so far, that's exactly what's happened. And so considering that energy production is growing at an exponential rate, considering population is growing at an exponential rate, and considering Bitcoin's following a hyperbolic adoption curve, I think the most probable scenario is that that continues tomorrow. And if it continues tomorrow, it's probably going to continue next week. And if it continues next week, probably next year. And every day, every week, every month, every year it survives, the probability of continuing that curve, in my opinion, just gets stronger and stronger. So anyway, here's the inverse of that chart again on a logarithmic sign. That's basically what Hal predicted, that everything would trend to zero against Bitcoin. So that's ultimately why this is one of my favorite designs here. I love the metaphor of the locomotive. And just to wrap on this point here, the locomotive I find really fascinating, number one, because I loved trains when I was little. But also number two, much more important and applicable here, is that the train was actually multiple things. It was multiple paradigms. The idea, the term mass transit system, it doesn't make sense before a locomotive. It's like, how many people can you fill in a horse? The idea of having a system that transports a large number of people over a long space, it just doesn't make any sense until the train shows up. So it's the first mass transit system. It's also a form of a weapon. I know many of you were here for Jason Lowry's speak at the last speaker. I really wish I was here, maybe next time. But it's the same thing. The locomotive was vital for national security and for nations. This is why America and Europe especially adopted so much of the locomotive. If your country, if your military doesn't have the rails and the trains throughout your cities and throughout your borders and throughout your nation, you can't move troops as fast as your other country. From a militaristic perspective, purely from self-defense, not even necessarily offense or from a place of exerting violence on others, just from a place of wanting to preserve yourself, you need the train for your government. Because if you don't, you will cease to have a government. The other will just stomp all over you because they can move their guns and their weapons and their men 10 times faster than you can, 100 times faster than you can, perhaps. And so I think, essentially, what we have all these other monetizable stores of value that we've had and that we've gained and we've gotten used to over the last decades and centuries. Stocks, bonds, cash, and all these other examples that we could go into. And I think what people are doing is they're inherently comparing these two and failing to understand that if this thing moves, then it's over for the horse. And so ultimately, to me, the only question that matters about Bitcoin is, does it work or does it not work? Because if it doesn't work, then it's a useless hunk of metal. Who cares? We'll keep using horses and feeding them hay, and the world will keep spinning around, whatever. But if it does move, if it does work, it's inevitable that it will continue to be improved, it will continue to be built upon, and this railway, this global or national railway will continue to be developed. There'll be more stations, there'll become more use cases for the locomotive. Right now it doesn't make sense to travel to foreign distant lands, to go from Michigan to Boston over plane, but all those things we built upon the locomotive, and that is what is so exciting about today, because the system that was the railway eventually became for the electric grid and the power lines, and then on top of that, we had computers that can convert that electricity information. On top of the computers, we had the internet that could communicate that information. And now we have Bitcoin atop this stacked layer of technological paradigms that in many ways start with the locomotive. And so, anyway, to conclude this first part here, that's what's so exciting to me, and that's why I encourage everyone to learn about it and educate others, because ultimately, the worst allocation of Bitcoin is 0%. In my view, that's the only justifiable one. So.